It's my pleasure to wrap up these 2 days. And I have to say, just listening to this panel, listening to our really brilliant keynote speakers, Jane today, Juguna last night, they have actually wrapped this up in a much more sophisticated way than I can do. I've asked Jane to give us what she said today in a write-up so that we can post it and I'll share it. It's really the agenda that I think we should all take from these 2 days. But the same is true for our panelists, for the other contributors that we've had here. It was a very exciting 1.5 days. Now we came here, or I think I started yesterday with the presumption, with the strong belief that the private sector is at the core of the development process. That's a recognition that the global community only came to a few years ago. This would have been a controversial statement just 10 years ago. I think by the time of Addis in 2015, there was a shift in sentiment, and you began to see that at the United Nations in September, the general meetings, you would suddenly have a fairly significant representation of the private sector. You would suddenly have Wall Street present. You would have all sorts of events around the private sector. That was not the case before. It is a general shift in the recognition that we're not going to deliver development the way we want to. We're not going to deliver on the SDGs if we don't have the private sector very, very much on board. And that has also led to a broadening of the development actors, of the development field. There was a time when it was a field for development organizations, national or international, for civil society organizations active in developing countries. Well, today that has really broadened, and we have impact investors who I see as a very promising and growing group of institutions that can provide finance where it's needed. We have pension funds in the North thinking about how to start investing in this field. You have individual companies, the much mentioned Unilever, but there's a range of others that are beginning to define themselves a little bit more explicitly in relation to the development agenda. JP Morgan has launched a development bank that is sort of an in-house development bank cutting across much of what they do in the corporate bank. Let's see how many more catch up, but it just shows that the development field is broadening. Now, one thing that, given this growing party that we have, but also the very significant objectives that we have together, is that we need to get it right. So how does the private sector develop, and how does it not de-develop? And we all have many, many examples from the history of economic development where we would all agree it's gone the wrong way, and the private sector can be a negative influence. So how does the private sector contribute in a very effective manner to development outcomes? This is where we have still a whole range of knowledge gaps, and that's the motivation behind this network. Measurement has become a very hot item. It's interesting, a few years ago, this was the preserve of specialists. Today, this is something, measurement becomes sort of an issue that is raised in all sorts of venues. I understand that the UK G7 presidency in 2021 has already put this on the agenda as part of the G7 impact measurement. Interesting. And we heard it here in these 2 days again and again. Second, we need evidence-based research in order to ground our assumptions. We make lots of assumptions when we invest because we believe that investment has a positive impact. When we then dig very deep, there is often a lack of evidence. There's even a lack of theory very often. So we need to build that up. And then one message that has come out again and again, and this was true for this last panel, it was true for several other interventions, is the need to understand how individual interventions, investments, transactions relate to broader change, to change at the sector level, to change at a market level, systemic change. Because in the end, the balance sheets of the development finance institutions, the funds that we have available for development are tiny compared to the overall problem. With the IFC, we've calculated it. I think IFC's annual financing represents something on the order of 0.2% of gross fixed capital formation in the countries that we work in. And you put in all the other development finance institutions, and it's not going to make the 1% mark, I believe. So this is not, it's not this 1% that is going to solve the development problem. We have to leverage this up to the 10, 20, 40%. And for that, we have to find ways of operating so that we change the way a whole sector functions, that we change the way investors think, unblock them in a much broader way than just in the individual projects that we do. So those are all good motivations to have this development network, this private sector development research network, for which we have to find a catchier acronym. Those are all very good reasons to have it, and I think this conference has shown that we're on a very good path. I think we have a good recipe here. It's a slightly chaotic recipe, by the way, but we combine research, we combine the impact community, we combine practitioners, DFIs, civil society organizations, and I'm missing many others. And it will, in fact, take all of us, it will take all of these perspectives in order to make a difference, because these are all real. But the result is, apart from being quite stimulating, and I've sat through many sessions which I found very, very stimulating and insightful, the result is also sometimes uncomfortable, because we are different groups that have tended to talk to themselves more than to each other. And sometimes we're sitting on different planets. We heard somebody say that today. We sit on one planet that looks at the micro end of things. We're sitting on another planet that looks at macro. But in addition, we think global, we think local, we think community, we think innovator, and all of these things don't get together easily. But they're all truth. They're all real. They're all parts of the problem that we need to solve. And the format that we have, I think, is going to help us get there. There are very different types of presentations and insights, but there are presentations by the researchers that flow fairly easily into the thinking that we need to develop in the DFIs. There are several examples that I'm taking from here that's coming back home. We're going to see how we can put them into action. And then for the researchers, I think it's very useful to get a sense of where the practitioners are going, what the main priorities are in development practice and development finance, because it heightens the relevance of the work they do if they can direct some of their expertise in that direction. Now, specifically on the conference, I was, like everybody else, of course, only able to see segments, but I've had colleagues writing up a bit of a collage of what we've seen. We discussed how to balance commercial and social objectives through inclusive business. We debated on the scope of inclusion. What does it mean for measurement? What do we take and what do we not take into account? We discussed the potential for different interventions, including financial interventions, to maximize inclusion impact. We were challenged as DFIs on the targets that we set to drive change on gender, on poverty. We heard cases that demonstrate that bringing inclusion into the decision equation for firms and governments is not the same in different places and areas, from transport to production to management and well-being. We covered 4 continents. We covered banks, garments, agribusiness, transport, health, education. And with that, we have only scratched the surface of what we need to understand better in the development field, in the private sector development field moving forward. how to measure the inclusion impact on a market level, I've mentioned this, and then to use that to prioritize our efforts, to replicate and to scale in ways that will bring us closer to the development goals. Technology offers so many more opportunities to advance this agenda, and that is another theme that was fairly persistent here. With lean data, satellite data, analytical tools, artificial intelligence, just to understand what we ourselves have as development finance institutions and everybody else as well. How to operationalize technology to reach more people in the underserved groups that we want to reach. We agree that we need to coordinate more, not just in our particular clubs, but across these clubs, that we need to develop joint analytics on impact measurement, understand other aspects of inclusion, stimulate feedback, and scale up to make a difference. This last panel just raised this question of coordination again in a very strong manner of the environment for private sector investment, which then requires different types of players. It's a very practical question for us at the IFC and I'm sure at the other development institutions as well. We're now working on building up the upstream capabilities to work upstream from our projects, meaning creating conditions for investments to happen rather than reacting to financing requests for investments. And if you can do that, you can impact at the sector level, but it requires a whole lot of other actors to get engaged. Take an example, affordable housing. The affordable housing market is a big prize out there, I think, for development finance institutions. It's a huge need that we see throughout the developing world as cities keep growing and transforming. And for that, you need to work at the municipal level on regulations, you need to work on land titling, you need to work on the availability of land, you need to work with construction companies, developers on materials. In Rwanda, for instance, cement is incredibly expensive, so how do you get there? You need to work on mortgages, on capital markets to bring in long-term capital. All these things have to come together to make this work. And we do this now, and we have a couple of promising situations where we work as IFC very closely together with the colleagues at the World Bank who have other tools who can do that. But this is a broad task. And we had a discussion earlier, Caroline, I don't know if she's still here, from Oxfam, about how one can better work together between DFIs and NGOs. We tend to do this in the ESG context. Well, one can also do that in the context of municipalities, for instance, where many NGOs are active and have a lot to offer to help organize communities for affordable housing developments, etc. So these are all examples of where different skills, different actors are needed in order to deliver big, because everything else, if we work the way we have typically worked, is going to be opportunistic and is going to be making just pinprick changes. To change a whole sector, to change that landscape, we need different actors to come together. Okay, now, what next? One thing for me is that this conference provided a very strong case for our network, and it provided a very strong case for continuing this series. It was somewhat ambitious to say this is the first conference of the network, because that implies that we were fairly certain there will be a second. I think after this event, I'm pretty sure we will have a second conference. We will be meeting later today among the different players here and try to see how we can, what we learned from this conference and how we take this forward, the conference itself, the network. And so that is one, I think, fairly concrete result for me. I will support that. My team, I'm sure, will support that. We also want to operationalize this knowledge. I have mentioned that before. I think we need to use the knowledge that gets created and that we've heard about to build that into the evidence-based. At the IFC, our AIM system, our impact system, needs this kind of evidence in order to make judgments on individual investments. There are a variety of insights from this conference which I can see flowing into our AIM sector frameworks to provide better bases for decision-making in the future. So there's a very practical use to this. It also challenges us to design interventions and investments in a way that draws on many of these insights. I was looking at the presentation on markets in Jaipur. I don't know if the presenter is still here. Yes, you're still here. I thought it was a really fascinating presentation, and it gives you a very simple, practical conclusion on inventories. And we, as IFC, and the same is true for CDC, the same is true for FMO and others, we all work with microfinance institutions. We work with institutions in India and elsewhere that are trying to reach women. If we can now work with them and advise them, help them structure their products with a focus on helping build inventory, that's something we can do. And I think this is what this conference and the results should challenge us, make it operational, make it useful. Another step that we're going to take is we're going to create a SharePost, to be honest, a SharePoint, which is going to be a platform for the community of networkers to post what they have and for the information that is going to come forward. So we will provide a bit of an electronic backbone to this network. Not sure when, perhaps Alexandros or Neil could tell us. Alexandros, when is SharePoint going to be available?
So the SharePoint will be operational this week, basically next week. But then there's going to be an external website in January, late January. But we will announce and we will circulate to all participants of the conference.
Good, and that's the other point that I was going to make. There's also going to be an effort to make the knowledge, the research, the thinking here available externally with a website. Also on the side, I think, of many of us, we will be using key insights from the conference for blogs, for other ways of communicating. So those are the next steps. And by the way, if any of you have ideas for themes for the next conference, please feel free to share them with us, with the organizers. We also welcome volunteers to host the next conference. Then I'm being told to ask you to please take the time to fill out the feedback form. We need a feedback form. And after all of this, I would like to thank again the Hugo and your team and the Graduate Institute for a really wonderful venue. I think in every respect this has worked very well. It was well organized. I found the food was good. This is just a fantastic space. Everybody had an interactive 2 days. Thank you very, very much.